of our discussion with the author, Alan Machado Prabhu, who is in the process of coming out with a brand new book on the Goa Inquisition. The newness of the book is not the point, but the newness of the ideas are, because for a change, Alan is actually talking about a lot many perspectives and issues related to the Goa Inquisition, which have not been discussed at all. Okay, so Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you and welcome everybody.
I think the first installment was viewed with a lot of interest. Some silence, and some inability to deal with the issue, because it's this perspective that you are giving us on the Goa Inquisition is really very different from what we've heard so far.
I think it needs some light on it. It really needs to be unraveled.
Hmm, that's true. So the first, just to start with, we will do a very brief recap without taking too much time, without getting in between you and the speaker. We'll do a brief recap of what we heard in the first part. So, Alan's book, as you know, is called Goa's Inquisition: Facts, Fiction, Factoids. It's coming out in 2022. We are a few weeks away from actually getting it in our hands. And in the first part, Alan talks about the statistics dealing with the Inquisition. So he reminds us that the Inquisition is a very kind of politicized, controversial, hot discussion issue to discuss, and getting unbiased evaluations of it are very difficult. So far, it was believed that most, if not all, of the information relating to the Inquisition was destroyed, which is not the case, as Alan tells us. He says that modern historians can now easily access a large volume of recently digitized primary documents in global archives. So not only are these documents available, but they've also been digitized. There is a language issue here. We would need to know some degree of Portuguese, and hats off to Alan. Though his roots are in Bangalore, he has actually learnt enough of the language, taught himself to understand what's going on there. We are still open to corrections and different insights into this, but the data is out there. Okay, Alan makes the point also very briefly that the Goa Inquisition survived for 252 years. It arrived in 1560 and it ended in
1812.
1812, with a short gap of 4 years in between. So 252 years in all. It recorded the proceedings of every case in a very careful manner, kept it in a secret archive, which is now opened up. Inventories were kept and things like that, and he tells us where they are kept. Uh, I think maybe I should just screen share what I'm reading out to you, so that you get an idea of where we are going. So yes, so this is the issue, and yeah. So as I was saying, the first part of the discussion told us about the records available, also the length of the Inquisition, which we all know, of course, and how many cases were held. And Alan gives us the facts to help us to understand the significance of the process. How serious was it? Is it exaggerated? What was its impact? So in these 252 years, how many cases were tried and things like that. So Alan tells us that almost 19,000 persons were investigated during these 252 years. 19,000. So that is cases investigated. We are not talking about
It,
persons.
a
Sorry.
small correction here. This is based on the available documents. The information is lost for some years. So if you average out and try to arrive at the entire thing, it could be maybe between 20 and 25,000 or so.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then he says out of these 19,000, these were the cases investigated, not people uh, sent for the death penalty or burnt or whatever it is. out of these, non-Christians constituted 25%. And I found this fact interesting. 88% of these non-Christian cases were conducted between 1685 and 1736. There's some almost five decade period when the Maratha conflicts were intensifying. So the politics of it come out quite clearly, and it was, many of these cases were from the provinces of the north, the areas around Bombay, Bassein, all these places where there was conflict also going on. And also he makes the point, Alan,
Yeah.
that there were some priests caught up in it. Almost 1.5% of the persons caught up in the Inquisition were priests for their own failings and their own faults, as seen sometimes from a religious perspective. The number of persons physically executed in 136 cases was actually 177. Now, this is not to justify any executions or whatever, but just put it in context and say that these executions have to be seen against many other forms of contemporary then and current punishments, including the death penalty, including the burning of witches, including many other medieval forms of punishment which existed in those times. Over to you, Alan.
Okay, thank you. Uh, Today we talk about the Black Legend. Let me begin by just uh, telling you a little this thing that in 1651, uh, I was doing this, I've been cataloging these cases and I came across this today that in 1651, two ladies, two women, were punished by the Inquisition for selling their minor daughters to temples across the border, for service in temples across the border. And the uh, uh, record says they were sold for a measure of rice and half a length of cloth. So you could just understand how cheap life was and how desperate these women were. The main qualification there is that these were Christian girls, minor girls. You see, so that is why they came under the purview of the Inquisition. Uh, that because they sold minor Christian daughters. Now, my question to you, and if some people can respond, my question to you is: what do you think? How do you think the Inquisition would have punished these uh, women who sold their own minor daughters to temples across the border for a measure of rice and half a length of cloth? Do you think they were burned?
I guess you're asking the
Yeah,
audience, but there will
yeah.
be some time lag in responding because
Well, okay. Then, if you if you believe in the Black Legend, I think you would believe that they were burned. But the actual punishment was uh, they were whipped and then sent to the gunpowder, the Polwara or the gunpowder factory. One Magdalena went for a year, and Joanna was sent for 2 years. So that is the extent of the punishment, or the that's to put into context the type of punishments that the Inquisition inflicted. Now, the Black Legend would have given a very different picture. Uh, and a
before
Black
that,
Legend,
Alan,
yes,
before that, small interruption.
yes.
You said from your figures, I'm not trying to minimize or justify anything, but you said from your figures that the number of killings or executions or burnings at the stake in those years were almost, where's that figure gone? Were, out of 19,000, I think 100 and
It's not out of 19,000. It is that figure comes from, I think it is 136 out of the fires. The number is there. The actual number in those out of the fires, I think, is about 6 or 8,000. I don't have figures in front of me.
No,
So
you said the number physically executed in 136 auto da fes, for which details are known, is 177.
yes.
So that means that in this 250-year period, almost about that is the number of executions. But how many of them are not known?
It's difficult to say, but I
Okay,
think this we could discuss in a later
okay,
session, which comes under the which
fine,
comes later. Yeah.
fair enough.
So now let's just talk about the Black
Yes,
Legend.
Yes.
So, a black legend is something which are stories or narratives that try to filter out all the positive aspects of an institution or a person or an event, and give only the negative pictures and as bad a light as possible for particular agendas. Uh, you see, the Portuguese Inquisition, they had four main centers. Uh, the main headquarters was at Lisbon. Then you had one at Evora and one at Coimbra, and the only overseas uh, headquarters was at Goa, which covered the whole distance, entire distance from Africa to Timor in
In
Macau,
East
Timor.
Asia, East Asia.
Yeah, East Asia. So, in all these documents, all the correspondence, all the records are kept in handwritten Portuguese, old Portuguese, and you can see the difference over the years in the writing and in the language and the manner of writing. And with ink and paper, ink being with the feather and pen, and so nothing could be really erased. So it was a very laborious process, but it was maintained, and they maintained them, and they sent these records over to once or twice a year over to Portugal. Uh, the important records, because transport was quite an expensive affair, and some of these ships were shipwrecked. So for some years we don't have these records. But fortunately, the records are available. These are the records to which we refer. What were burnt and lost were basically in 1812 were largely the trial details, but not the names and the results. So from these we can deduce certain things, because some trials details were also sent to Portugal. So from that you can make some sort of assumptions, but they're really not very uh, accurate in that way. Because history is
Would
quite
these be
subjective.
some records that you perused? This kind
Yes,
of
yes,
records?
that is correct. The top one is for Asolna in 1686. The second one is at Kukuli in 1694, and the last is the auto de fe that was held in Zouin in 1699. So this is the heading of this, and the details. When we come to the auto de fe, I will go into detail on how they were recorded and some other details. I'll put something up there. Coming back to the Black Legend, you see, these records, all, as I said, they were secret and written in Portuguese. Now, the Black Legend is largely an Anglo-centric literary affair. They come up in a bit in Northern European languages, especially Dutch, and in English. English is the largest one. So these writers had no access to Inquisition records. They based their legends a bit of like Gothic novels and other things, and on hearsay, because they were written in 1600s, 1700s as such. Now, how did this originate? To look at this, we need to go back to the rivalry, to the Spanish occupation of Holland, or they were called the Low Countries at that time, Netherlands, and this dates back to about 1580s. In 1585, England sent an army to ally with the Dutch and to fight the Spaniards in Holland. And this military offensive intensified, and shortly afterwards, I think it was about in 1588, I could be a year or two this way or that way, the Spaniards, Philip II of Spain, sent his armada to conquer Protestant heretical England in his view. And of course, the armada was lost, and he lost an entire navy there. But this military conflict and naval conflict then intensified into a propaganda offensive, largely fueled by uh, the Anglo-centric literature. The It's around this time, that is in 1687, that Charles Delon's book came out. Now, I will be talking about Delon in a future session. So suffice it to say here that Delon was a prisoner who appeared in the auto de fe of 1676, and then was sent to Lisbon to carry out his sentence, which was in the galleys. But there he was reprieved and sent. He went back to uh, northern England, and his book was published. First book was published in Leiden, in Holland, in 1687. Uh, this was contrary to his undertaking that he had given to the inquisitors that he would keep everything secret. But fortunately, he didn't keep that secret. Otherwise, we would never have had this inside information uh, of the how things were conducted from within the Sabayo Palace. In 1736, uh, a Dutch prelate, uh, I'm not sure which religious congregation, but it was Protestant gentleman.
Alan,
Yes.
many of the subsequent accounts depend a lot on Delon's rendering of what he saw or what he went through in that sense,
Yes.
including Priol current.
Yes, yes. I'll come to Priolka
Yeah,
a little later today. But the big, this gentleman, Limborch by name, produced really truly massive and study of the entire process and how trials were conducted, how the Inquisition operated, and anything. And this is quite remarkable because, in the sense that the Inquisition's methods were quite secretive. So how we got this information, we don't know, but they are very accurate if you look at it today. And this anybody interested can download this book. It's available online. Now, now, Limbosch mentions Delon in his bibliography. So the book, he has referred to his book, and he mentions that some of the things which is taken straight from Delon's book. For instance, that the at the auto de fe they were given bread and figs because of the long process. So we know that he has referred to Delon's book, and he mentions it in the bibliography. Now, this book became the standard work for British and Scottish writers, and some of them, a number of other books began appearing shortly afterwards in England, and many of them some of them plagiarized entire pages and chapters. Now, Limbosch, Rico, can you put that? Is that available? Number one,
right. Just
is
give
it?
me a second.
Yeah.
You carry on.
Yeah,
I will.
I'll talk as I'll try to put on. So Limbosch made it very clear that his intention was to expose the Inquisition, uh, while at the same time he did take a very positive, quite a good historical, um, academic or scholarly view of analyzing it. But then he peppered his texts with the quotations from the Old Testament and this thing about how the inquisitors were waiting like in a lion in a den with a I, no I think yes, okay. So is, is
This
it
one.
is it possible to just enlarge the font a bit?
Uh, I'll
I'm
I'll
so I'm
I'll
sorry.
go out. No problem. I'll do it. Give me a little while. You carry on.
Okay. Uh, so, Limbosch's motive was very clear, while he took a very academic approach and a correct approach in that way. But he did mention, and you can see it in the introduction, which I think the introduction itself is about 40 or 50 pages, and which goes into detail on why the Inquisition was so wrong. So, from that point of view, the Black Legend begins to take shape, and the English audiences were very eager to have all these things, and they were fed by very good, by writers with certain things. Rico, it's okay.
Okay,
It's okay if you skip that
fine,
because I'm
fine.
sorry I didn't do it properly, but
Don't worry.
you'll find all this in the book itself. It's from the book.
Yeah,
Don't worry about that, Rico. Just
fine, fine. Carry on.
now, the this black legend reached India. This black legend reached India with Reverend Claudius Buchanan. Now, this was the time he reached Goa in 1806, Now, this was the time when the East India Company had just begun expanding and acquiring territory all over India. And Wellesley, the Earl of Mornington, he had just defeated Tipu in 1799 and had sent an army to occupy Goa under the pretext that it was going to be uh, made a French base. Now, Buchanan started in Bengal, and he came with the uh, clear impression that India was ready to receive the uh, the Christian God as such, and he was coming in a divine, I mean, in a way to give it. And right through, you find that he criticizes a lot of Indian customs, religious customs as well, and he makes some very disparaging comments on the Jagannath Puri festival, uh, highlighting all the unsavory parts as such. From there, he came down to Tamil Nadu, to Madras, uh, and made some these things there. Then went to Malabar, where he tried to make contact with the Syrian Christian church. And there he writes, from there he wanted to visit Goa, where, as he puts it, the fires of the Inquisition were recently lit. Now, this is at a time when the fires had died down for over 2 decades, because the last public auto de fe was held in 1783 or 84, 1784 it would be, and I think the last execution was around that time. So just one person or so. Uh, so, it was a highly exaggerated way of putting it across, because when we say recently lit, it was not the case at all. All auto de fes after that were privately held within the palace, within the Sabayo Palace. Now, Buchanan reached Goa, and he makes his motive very clear, because he says, he mentions it there, that he has written this narrative uh, primarily to instigate the British government into having the Inquisition closed. And of course, it worked, because it worked for other reasons as well. The other reasons as well, because by then the king had to leave Portugal and had established his court in Rio de Janeiro, because there was some sort of a political upheaval in Portugal itself. And the Inquisition was practically a dead end. Old Goa was practically abandoned. There was nobody there.
But did Britain have any role to play with that, with the ending of the Inquisition, or what?
That I do not know. That I do not know. Maybe a future scholar can analyze that. But I'm just talking of the timing as such. Now, he came with quite a lot of trying to put up a bravado that he was coming into a lion's den, where actually there were no lions. There were just a few, whatever you want to say. And he met the second inquisitor, the junior inquisitor, who was an Augustine priest. And they fell to discussing there. And he invited him, because he says he was a very learned man and a little elderly. And he invited him to stay at the convent of the Augustine convent, which he did. But all along, he mentions in his narrative, completely everywhere, that even the two, uh, this fear of being arrested and locked up in that, what he calls dungeons. There were no dungeons as per the plans that are available to us, and that they may be thrown into the fire as such. So he peppers his narrative with these things. And in fact, he mentions an incident where, in the middle of the night, he was woken up by some screaming, and he rushed out of this room, thinking his servants had been caught and taken by the inquisitors. But actually, it was a little boy who was staying in the convent, and he thought he had seen a ghost and started screaming. And these monks had come out and were trying to calm him down. So, the real narrative is different, but the black legend which he portrays and pushes is a little different again.
Alan, just a small interruption.
Yes.
Of course, I'm no historian and I don't read original records and I don't have access to them. but whatever you're saying is most interesting, and it also ties up with an essay written by someone called David Higgs, one of the few critical essays that challenges what we believe about the Inquisition. David Higgs wrote the Inquisition in late 18th century Goa in this book called Goa Continuity and Change. It's quite a standard book edited by Professors Narendra Wagle and George Coelho from the University of Toronto in 1995. Rare to come across because it's published in Canada. But David Higgs is one of the few persons who challenges it, and he talks specifically about Buchanan and also Delon. And he says that he of course says Delon's version was an exuberant account of his misfortunes, and likewise, Buchanan wanted to think that what he was not allowed to see in the old Goa of 1885 was what Delon unveiled at more than a century earlier. In that sense, this is a quote from the book Goa Continuity and Change. Carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. There are other accounts. One is by the French scholar called, I think, Charles Amiel, uh, or is it Amiel or is it Amis? I can't remember offhand. But he gives a very good account, in which I will come to when we come to the chapter on Delon and Ephraim. Now, Buchanan made a nuisance of himself and sort of took advantage of his host. And he was taken in, his host took him into the Sabayo palace. But then he said, I want to see the dungeons. And that's when he was finally said, okay, now you pack off. He was packed off from there. But frankly, there are no dungeons, as when we discuss on the uh, plans of the uh, flow plans of the Woodlanger, we will come to that.
What plans did you access?
These are the plans. One was commissioned in 1636 by the Inquisitor Castro, and the second one was commissioned by the Portuguese government around 1780, after the Inquisition was first closed, to see how the building could be used for other government purposes.
These are available online. These are
Yes,
available
yes,
online.
yes, yes, yes. And I've also given a simplified plan in the book. So, uh, and I've given where these things can be accessed, the reference points as well. Uh, the next stage of this narrative in India, before I come to that, now in Buchanan's book came out in 1806, but in 1808, an officer in the Bengal Army, an Englishman, wrote a scathing response to Buchanan's narrative, saying that this approach will antagonize and create a lot of unrest. Uh, and he calls Buchanan's view as with a jaundiced eye, and he says that it will be a pity if this creates a banner of revolt under the religious thing. And sure enough, it happened. Within 4 decades later, uh, we had our first war of independence. That's in 1857. So I think this book. Yeah. So it is only one narrative over there.
So, what would be the connection between 1857 and this?
No, he mentioned that this approach of trying to evangelize and
Okay,
bring this so-called
in British India, in British
yeah
India.
would create a lot of unrest and
Okay,
would do this thing.
okay,
So evidently the army was not in favor of it, because they knew how fragile the entire system was, uh, with their drawing people from different religions and castes and other
yeah.
things. They knew it much better than blue-eyed evangelists. So we next come to the Indian version of the Black Legend, and that's where I come to.
Just one point before we move ahead. So, my reading, what I understand you are saying also is that this a lot of the Black Legend here is generated by this conflict or rivalry between North European colonizers and the South European colonizers. The South, who probably had the upper hand in the early phases and were being discredited after the arrival of the printing press. Am I reading you right from what I've read elsewhere? Also, is that a correct version? Is that a correct interpretation?
Uh, I, uh, no, you're talking of the Black Legend in India.
Yeah, in Goa, but also the black legend of the Goa Inquisition is also connected to the black legend of the Spanish Inquisition in a certain way. I'm saying broadly generalizing and seeing the Spanish and the Portuguese Inquisition as a continuum, though they were not one and the same thing. We know that, but I'm saying the rivalries between these two colonial powers, the former colonized in the form of the Dutch. Was it a kind of a colonial rivalry that also resulted in this?
Not necessarily colonial. It was a religious rivalry as well.
I see.
Let me point out something else, which you have raised a point now. Delon's book was first published in 1687, and shortly afterwards, there were about 14 or 15 new editions at that time, because there was a lot of interest and curiosity about this. But then you find around the time of Buchanan's visit here, that is from in the early 19th century, a large number of English versions, translations suddenly appear, and many of them in America, from Philadelphia and these things, and all from Protestant sources. Uh, Now, what this brings out there suddenly is there's a lot of uh, attempt. I think this coincides. Okay, I could be wrong here, but I think this coincides with a push by emerging Protestant sects uh, to evangelize, the in this colonial, the lot of new people that have been colonized. So this book became handy for them to show against their main Christian rival, which was the Catholic Church, to put that in the
Alan,
spotlight.
there are wheels within wheels, and it sometimes can be
Yeah,
really hard to understand what's
yeah,
going on here.
exactly.
I was trying to even decipher it myself, and I think the same essay which I referred to by Higgs talks about the splits within France itself. Now, France is a
Mm.
Catholic country. How do you explain the stance taken by Delon, for example? But Higgs brings up this issue of the splits within diverse quarters in France. He talks about the factions that were there: the Jansenists, the Galicians, the pro-Protestants, and the anti-Spanish Frenchmen, who, some of whom found this convenient to campaign their own cause on, to run a campaign for their own cause. And Delon has himself, I think he puts it, Delon has himself been identified with pro-Calvinism and the Galician policy of Louis XIV, to which court Delon had been admitted. So it's more complicated than we actually even can imagine. Carry on.
Yeah,
Sorry.
we'll go into that in much more detail when we get to Delon. But you raised a point there, Rico, and this is that France, you see, the Portuguese drew the legitimacy here as far as the religious authority was concerned, and from and used their this thing under the propaganda. I mean the Padroado Real, but the French uh, had the rival, the propaganda fide. You see, so these at the religious level there was this rivalry as well. On the political level, there was the rivalry of state rivalry between the French colonists and the Portuguese colony, because these were newcomers. So it's very complicated, and we can't just simplify and give some simple narrative and say this is it, and under religious bigotry and all. It's not like that at all. It's far more complicated and needs a lot of understanding before we can. And even then, we will never come to the entire complete truth. I don't think we can, because it's too far away to know, and there are a lot of things, and a lot of detail has been lost, and a lot of details are still hidden away in some archives. So that brings us now to 1961, and that is Priolkar. Now, I, you see the final this one of Priolkar's the view that we have, a lot of the opinion or the opinions and the knowledge that we have, or the narratives that we had of Goa's Inquisition, comes from Priolkar. Now, Priolkar has done a good job. I mean, there's no doubt about that. He did study certain things and other things, but I think it was not a very balanced book, and I'm not sure that he took in all the information that he had. He was selective in some of the narratives that he took. For instance, uh,
You've given one example there where you talk
yeah,
about Cunha Rivara and all that.
Yes, it's there in the book, but it's also there. Just coming to his book, the book is divided into two parts, really. The first part is about 189 pages, and the second part of 100 pages is devoted entirely to reproducing, just reproduction of Buchanan's narrative about the Goa Inquisition and Delon's narrative, which was useful at that time because these were not available really. If you look at Buchanan's narrative that he reproduces, it's only regarding Goa's Inquisition. But to be fair, he should have also mentioned that what Buchanan had said about Jagannath Puri, or about the other things in his travel. You can say it was a book on the Inquisition, but then to get an understanding, because we need to assess who says what, we need to assess who needs what, and in which case it's only then we will understand what is going behind it. So when he doesn't mention this, for instance, Buchanan also mentioned the gave statistics of sati taking place in Bengal, and the figures are compared a much, in a short span of about 6 months, are far more. It's about 200 or 300 women in about 6 months' time in a short small place of Bengal alone. Now, when you compare that to 177 over 270 years or 250 years, that puts things in perspective. It's not defending anything, it's just putting things in perspective. Now, so when you come back to that 189 pages that he devotes to, out of that, only about half of it is devoted to the Goa's Inquisition proper. Okay, and that is largely from secondary sources. He has not accessed any primary sources, obviously, because these were still confidential, but he knew they were there because he quotes from Adler. He quotes and reproduces statistics from Adler, and Adler specifically mentions that he got this information from the library in Lisbon.
So, what's the point?
So he knows that this information was there, but he doesn't. But he still says that, very blandly states that all this information was destroyed. And with that, he then says that he gives some very disparaging remarks about the inquisitors. Now, if the information is destroyed, how do you arrive at this information, at this conclusion? That's a question.
Just to add to the politics of it all, Priolkar's book was first published in 1961, few months before the end of Portuguese colonial rule in Goa. So it was a time of much contestation of past, present, future. And not only that, Priolkar's book gets republished 4 times in that sense, by 4 different quarters, including the Bombay University Press, University of Bombay Press. So like, I think there is a certain politics to publishing also, which all of us are guilty of in that sense. Tell, carry on.
Yeah, could be. Yeah. So, you know, even the secondary sources, for instance, he also devotes about 60 pages to discuss the authenticity of Delon's book. Now, there is no question that Delon's book was, it was a genuine book, because although a couple of Christian authors like our Gerson da Cunha and someone else had questioned it, and I think some Braganza was there. I can't remember the name again. But they had questioned the authenticity, and he discusses it and says why the book was accurate. But having read Bayan's book, Antonio Bayan's book, Bayan reproduces Delon's name as it was written in the inventory of 1774. And that is there. So all Priolka had to do was just reproduces that, and in one paragraph dismiss those 60 pages.
Why?
Because if you produce that signature, that name, and says it appeared in the inventory, obviously the Inquisition itself acknowledges that he was a prisoner.
Okay, so you're saying that he spent 60 pages to prove that Delon was not a figment of imagination and that he was a historical figure who existed and went through the Inquisition. So he spent, but there were quicker ways to make that point.
I think the motive also could be to discredit Gerson da Cunha and the others as well. It could be. I don't know.
Hmm.
It's a kind of conclusion that appears. I could be very wrong, but if
Right.
I was to write that, I would just reproduce this and say yes, there it is. And there are documents in Rio de Janeiro, two or three documents which acknowledge the receipt of, the prisoner Delon in Rio, and then again there is another acknowledgement from Lisbon saying, yes, we have received the prisoner Delon. These documents are there in Rio de Janeiro, and you can access them online as well.
I see. Amazing what you can
Yeah,
do today.
yeah, sitting at your desk.
Yeah.
Okay, these things were not available to Priolka. Again, I don't know what funds were available to him, but for that matter, funds are not available to me either. But uh, I have access to a lot more with modern technology and a lot of work that is being done. So I would recommend to the modern scholar and the researcher to genuinely go through these things, access them. If you like to know, I've given all references in the book. You can get where you can get these things, and all you have to do is take a little time, spend time, and you'll get there.
But then, Alan, the point is, as they say, where you stand determines on what you see, determines what you see. Where you
Yeah,
stand
again,
determines what you
it
see.
comes to the
Political positions.
what you want to see and
What do you want to
present
believe?
as something. What you don't like or which doesn't agree with you, you push away. That's
Yeah.
not the way history works. You should present all the facts and then come to certain conclusions, and whatever you know about the authors who present certain facts.
And if necessary, we would need to even change our perspective on a fact when we find
Yes,
contrary evidence to it.
this is exactly what I'm going to do with my first book, which I wrote 20 years ago. I need to
Saraswati.
revise the facts because new facts are available.
So you're saying that Saraswati's Children, which you wrote 20 years ago and which is widely popular now, is not exactly how you see the world today, and you would probably
No,
need to
no,
revise it
I admit it. You see, because the data on which I wrote that book is
based
is
20 years back.
inadequate, I would put it, and it's something that was available then. Today, much more information is available, and from very different disciplines. Like, for instance, on the. But anyway, we'll talk about that some other time.
Yeah, yeah,
But
but
what I'm saying is,
just to add to that point, I'm saying we are shaped by what we know. So that is there, and we have to admit that we are learning all the time. In our youth, the debate about the Inquisition was very, very heated, and the Priolkar book was widely available then too, and it actually shaped our belief of religion, of our worldview. Today, in the light of after that kept coming up many times, and we kept seeing certain forces pushing this argument stronger than other forces. Then you start thinking that it's there seems to be something more to it, and that led us, some of us, to keep on trying to think about it. There have been n number of debates on GoaNet. I've written a few articles, not like your scholarly works, but a few articles based on my encounter with literature related to the Inquisition. And today we have a different perspective on it. Carry on. Sorry for interrupting.
yeah. So we are coming to the basic thing that we need to revise history. Our views as new evidence is made available to us. You see, and so that's one of the things. Now, I just want to conclude what I have to present on this particular topic by just quoting something which I think it was uncovered by Teotonio de Souza. That's in 1642. No, if the Inquisition was so much of a feared and a black legend in Goa at that contemporary time, in 1642, the Gaonkars of Salsette requested the king, had complained to the king of a lot of injustices and other things that were happening in to their um, organization, and had requested the king to appoint the Inquisition directly to investigate all these matters. And they pointed out government officials, including the Jesuits as well, who were giving them a lot of trouble. So, if the Inquisition was really viewed in such a bad light or feared thing at that time, why would these Gaonkars have requested the king to have the Inquisition come here? It's just a rhetorical question which I want to end with. It creates a doubt that the perception of the Inquisition at that time could have been different from what it is today or what has been created. So a black legend has been created for
Hmm.
purposes. The first purpose in Goa itself, because of to try to discredit the Portuguese government and push them out of Goa as part of the independence war. This is the same thing that happened with the English and the Spaniards. So in that case, it's a propaganda thing, which is necessary, which happens. But do we believe so many things? We need to look at these things in with an open light and find out really what happens.
There's a very interesting page on the Wikipedia about the Spanish Black Legend. Of course, these are just basics, and the Wikipedia is subject to checking and things like that. But it gives you an insight into how the Spanish Black Legend came about. If you were to be asked, Alan, how the Goa Black Legend came about, who would you say are the forces behind pushing it? I have my own theories, but I like to listen to you.
Uh, well, I would say first is some of our own, Goan Christian authors themselves, because quite a few, and one of them is the um, famous freedom fighter, Kuna,
Tristan Braganza Cunha.
Christian Bruganza Kuna. Then there is, I think, one Barreto as well, who's quoted by Priolka, and they make remarks, and also Xavier Neri, when he quotes about these
Definitely.
things. Uh, he was a bit earlier than this time,
Yeah.
but but they have mentioned the Inquisition in a very bad light, as a feared organization and cruel. This ones, I
Of
don't know
course, of
what their
course, of
reasons.
course, of course. Just to step in here, we need to consider, to acknowledge one thing, particularly in the 1920s, thereabouts, early 20th century, the colonial state and the church were so close together, both Portuguese-run organizations, that a lot of people not wanting the Portuguese here tended to get an allergy towards religion for understandable reasons, because religion played such a huge force in their lives and a conservative force, and as a result of which they many of the leading freedom fighters of those times were also anti-religious, anti-clerical. Plus, keeping in mind that the moods of those times were, like, right from Mexico to Spain, republicanism, wanting to shirk off the overpowering nature of the church and things like that. So that way, that historical context could be understood and could be explained.
Yeah, because religion was one of the pillars of the Portuguese state. It was part of the
Hmm.
ideology, and one of the Inquisition was tasked to keep uh, Christians within the fold as such. So by undermining that pillar, you'd weaken the state structure as well. So this
and
was one
then
of
and
the
then and then you find this is interesting. You find the freedom fighters grafting their own agenda onto this British, North European, South European conflict, which already is portraying the Inquisition, the
yeah.
Portuguese state, as very fanatical. Spain gets shown as extremely fanatical in Latin America, which they were. I'm not denying they were not, but other colonial powers were as bad. Like the Dutch never get spoken about, say, in Indonesia, or the British in large parts of the world or something. So there is a kind of perceptional bias in how we perceive different colonialisms in that sense, if you agree.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a very complicated issue, and we can't. I
Mm.
don't think any individual is really fully qualified to give a
Yeah.
complete explanation. We can only look at certain aspects and come out with certain things of a very big story, smaller stories. So I think basically my approach is just to uncover as many facts as possible, try to analyze them, put them in the context, uh, try to analyze why somebody said certain things, uh, what was the background, and then the things to do that, and then try to arrive at some kind of a. But even that will never take you to the entire truth. But it'll bring you a little closer, and I think you will feel a bit more comfortable that you are in a more correct position as to what really happened.
There seems to be a Jewish perspective on the Goa Inquisition, a Hindutva perspective on the Goa Inquisition, which also takes us along this road. Would you agree?
There are, because you see, it's not specifically the Jews. The Jews suffered quite a lot, uh, and Jews and the new Christians, that was the converts, suffered quite a lot, both in Spain and Portugal. Because the new identity that was being created in Spain by Isabella and Ferdinand uh, ex- wanted to erase these two identities there in creating a new state identity. And that spilled over into Portugal and from Portugal into Goa as well, or the Estado de India. Uh,
But there is a bit of a conflict there because Jews have also played a key role in the colonial state, propping up the colonial state of India, no?
Yes, you see what happened in some ways, and this is, I'll propose it here. If some scholar could do his PhD or whatever, investigate into this, it's very interesting to see the role that the Jews played in the Portuguese economy, and that the non-Christians played in the Goan economy under Portuguese. This thing, because in Portugal, the new Christians and the Jews were deprived of a lot of privileges of the older, of what you call the old Christians. So they were pushed into trading and into the financial sectors. In Goa, also, the Gaonkaris hands they are passed into ownership of Christians very largely, by the laws that were created. So those who preferred to remain in the ancestral religions had to move into new enterprises like economics and finance, and they had tremendous acumen, and they controlled a lot of the economy. Even that today, you see the big industrial and financial houses in Goa are controlled by very competent non-Christians.
Hmm. Interestingly, some feedback here. Dr. Celsa Pinto
Mhm.
is appreciating your work on the subject. The historian Dr. Celsa Pinto, whose
Thank you,
role
Celsa.
in Indo-Portuguese history, this side of the Suez, has been rated very highly. She says she commends you for taking up a matter that is so controversial in Goan history. Uh, none seemed inclined to write about after Priolkar. Okay, and then she also adds that she is also working on the Inquisition since 2015. I too read the records in Torre de Tombo in Lisbon itself. We really
That's
look
very
forward to
good,
her work. Yeah.
because that might bring out some things that I have missed out, which obviously I have, because
Okay.
there's so many records, and
And
it's good that,
there's so much scope for work on this topic,
so
isn't
the
it,
more
Alan?
people that work on it, the better.
It's far from complete. Would you say? Would you agree? The work on it.
Of course, there is a tremendous amount of work, and again, you see, I'm not that. I mean, it's very different when you are Portuguese is your language and your scholarship in that. My knowledge is not enough to bring out these things, but it is enough to bring out a certain aspect. See, so it's good that more people are into it.
Yeah. Just by way of an overview, I will, if you don't mind, do a little bit of a screen share of your text,
Hmm?
and just one second, 28, and maybe just go recap for those who joined us late.
Hmm.
Just have a look at. Oops, not this one, not this
No,
one. Yeah,
this the earlier one.
yeah. Give me a sec. I'll be there.
I'll have a water break.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So basically, we are talking about the creation of the Black Legend, and in today's discussion, Alan made the point that Goa's Inquisition suffers from an image that grew blacker as the centuries passed. Every shade of black has its creator, and every creator has his reasons. Very interesting. So he talks about the creation of the Black Legend from the early days of the Spanish Inquisition, with English and Dutch Protestant writers from the 16th century were instrumental in playing this role. I also think that the role of the printing press in this conflict between Protestant Europe and Catholic Europe has been highlighted in quite a few quarters, and very fascinating the way technology plays a role in promoting ideology and rivalry, and also then Britain being convulsed between violent confrontations between Catholic and Protestant factions, and in 1585, the English army joining the Dutch forces in fighting an occupying Spanish army. And don't forget that the Dutch also blockaded Goa, if I'm not mistaken, exactly at the same time
1601, the
when Goa was
first
under the
blockade.
control of the Spaniards, right?
Yes.
That's very interesting. So, and then once Spanish rule over Portuguese ends, then the Dutch blockade also ends. So, so that rivalry comes out very clearly. And then, of course, Alan discusses the role of Delon and Buchanan in creating this understanding that we have today. And of course, the role of Reverend Claudius Buchanan, who was a Protestant missionary, is still waiting to be understood, because you can't take one side of his point of view and not his other side. So if he's tremendously biased on how he sees the Puri Rath Yatra, for example, logic is going to tell you that he's also going to be biased towards other forms of religion which are not his own. So then the question comes up, that why we accept some and not the others. Any last words, any comments that you'd like to make, Alan, on this? Or maybe if we have some questions coming up from our audience.
Yeah, if there are any questions, I would be happy to share with you.
We have got a long question here which is a bit difficult to display on the screen. If the questions could be a
Is
bit
this is
briefer.
this related to the Inquisition, or is it just a statement?
That's the issue. It's a little bit difficult because the size of it makes it difficult to view on the screen. But if there are any quick questions that you would like to share, that's from William Afonso. But if there are any quick questions you'd like to share, feel free to. Questions, comments, whatever. I think there is one here which says that many right-wing elements refer to Anant Priolkar's book on the Goa Inquisition. Yeah, which is what we covered.
Well, everybody also does that because that's the main book, only book that is really available.
Yeah. Which are the other texts that are available?
On the Goa Inquisition, hardly
Yeah,
anything. But
hardly.
interestingly, there is a novel that was written in Germany, and it came out in 1780 or 1790, which uh, which I summarize it in the book. And it's a novel, pure fiction, but it's purported to be factual and based on Goa Inquisition, where this lady, Portuguese lady, comes and then identical in many aspects. So plagiarized. So it existed at that time as well.
Yeah,
And
they
then
had a
you have,
different approach toward plagiarism. They would take large chunks and just claim it as their own, and there was no problem with that.
but then he also mentions the motive behind it. Is saying that all uh, the nations that are dominated by this religion of popery and priests, like Spain and Portugal, those people are all suppressed and dumb, and the bright open freedom of England, Switzerland, and Germany. This is what is the shining light for the future. So
That
it's
was that was the
yeah,
religious war of those times, no,
yeah.
between Catholicism and Protestantism.
Yeah, it was re-emerging to the beginning of the 18th century, and that would be an interesting topic to explore. How it
You
affected India as well.
you mentioned fiction, but I think there are maybe half a dozen to one dozen books dealing with the Goa Inquisition itself, supposedly in the world of fiction, each of which borrows liberally from these so-called facts which are taken
Yeah.
as the base of our knowledge. So you have Zimler's Guardian of the Dawn, you have Uday Bemre's recent one, Voldegor, and there are many other books that focus on the Inquisition. In fact, I've devoted some columns of mine in the newspapers to
Mhm.
focus on books that look at the Inquisition or base their arguments on the Inquisition, and they assume that all that we know is the truth, which is very interesting, and that creates its further legend, and it keeps on going. And when you say the word Inquisition, like, this is what comes to your mind. Interesting.
That's why it's necessary to question and to bring out other facts. Of course, there's still more many facts, both.
Right.
But I
Yeah.
think I would conclude by saying that if they, I think some of the things that are now coming out will make the black a little bit of more of gray, shades of gray, and maybe even lighter gray in time. Not entirely white, but I think that's what, to me, is what this new availability is sort of suggesting. We'll
You
have,
said to conclude, and we exactly crossed the 1 hour mark. Time flies when we are talking on subjects like this.
okay,
I don't know
I'm not
why.
looking at the clock.
But one last question, maybe just to for those who missed us last time. Can you give us the figures very briefly to put it in context once again to show the Inquisition against other institutions of its time and maybe capital punishment today in that sense? Some figures.
Offhand, it's a little difficult, but I have come to that in that session on the uh, future session that we'll be discussing. I'll be prepared for that. But I've got them all in the book as such, you know. But I think if you take Protestant England itself, uh, vaguely I remember at King Henry's time, I think there were about 36 executions for under heretical laws. In Mary's time, it went up to something like 3 or 400, and
Per
in
per what?
within
Total. Total.
within about 4 years,
Okay.
which is so much higher than what we have here. And even in Elizabeth's time, it I could be wrong, but it's there in that this thing. It was at least about maybe about double the number, about 300 people or so, in a very short span.
Right. This is the cover of your book.
Uh,
And
sl- yeah,
sorry, carry on.
it's slightly different, but not much. I mean, you can take this as the cover itself.
So and the statistics that you highlight are here in the on the back cover.
Some of them, just a very smattering, just about 3 or 4 I've given.
Okay.
But you'll find a lot of statistics inside, in the
Yeah.
tables inside, all summarized on different aspects, on
Yeah.
all sorts of aspects. So it
Right.
really opens out a lot of things which uh, for future scholars to work on.
Yeah. One final question around the time here. Uh, prior to Tipu Sultan incident, I guess the captivity of the Mangalorean Christians. Since most clergy in Mangalore were from Goa, are there any chances of Mangalorean Catholics undergoing trial by the Inquisition?
In fact, I mentioned one. He was the vicar of Umzur, and he was not a Mangalorean. He was a oh, this is Mangalorean Catholics. Okay, yes, I've got a few of names are there of who are there, not just Mangaloreans, also Goan Catholics, and also the vicar. Uh, uh, these were, some of them were the Catholics were Tipu's slaves. You know, they were taken into the Ahmedi Corps, of which
Yeah,
I mention a lot go into a lot of detail in Slaves or Sultans. I think I've got about 16 or 17 names who appeared before the Inquisition voluntarily and were pardoned. But the interesting thing is for Mangaloreans is that the vicar of Umzur at that time was one Father Mendes, and he, when he went back to Goa, uh, he appeared for the crime as voluntarily before the Inquisition for the crime of solicitation.
what's that?
Solicitation is uh, um, trying to obtain favors of women in the
Okay,
confessional.
I
Yeah.
see.
So
So,
so when you look at this,
no, in that film, Alan, in that film, which I was mentioning last time, the myth of the Spanish Inquisition,
yeah,
done by BBC 1994, they make the suggestion that the Inquisition there, they're not talking about Goa, the Inquisition there was probably more fair and more trustworthy than the parallel
civil.
infrastructure, judicial infrastructure of its times. So some people might have preferred to face up to the Inquisition rather than face up to the civil tribunals or whatever. That's what their point is, quoting historians.
That is there. There is a famous case of one of the Nayaks, was a Catholic Nayak from Salset. I think his name was Colosso. Again, I mentioned it's there covered in my book. Who was um, arrested by the civil authorities for assaulting some people who were the contractors of his coconut farm. And he appealed to the king that he wanted to be tried by the Inquisition and not by the civil courts. Uh, but of course, the inquisitors found him guilty and punished him with some financial thing and took away his, dismissed him as from being a Nayak. So, when you look at these things and when we go through some of the trial procedures, you find a very judicial, legal kind of system that's at work.
So, Alan, what prompted you into taking up this issue, which is in a way close to you, but also 600 kilometers at least away?
On Goa,
On the Inquisition, on the Goa Inquisition to be specific. 5 years
it's
back, you worked
it's
5 years on it.
it's been a very interesting thing for me right from my childhood, because uh, we always had some kind of a fear of the inquisitors and the Inquisition. But specifically, and this I mentioned in the introduction to the book itself, that my uncle had around the 1970s had said that we had emigrated from, our ancestors had emigrated from Aldona. We were Prabhus and Gaunkars there, and had emigrated somewhere with a lot of other immigrants around this period. And he mentions they didn't know the cause, but it could have been famine, or it could have been invasions, or it could have been the Inquisition. So I said, let me try to see if I can find any names. And when I came across this huge list, uh, I was just drawn into trying to search and find this.
Everyone blames the Inquisition for everything, so it's a good.
It's easy because they're not there to defend themselves anymore.
But one question that has come up here, someone wants the answer for the next or the next after next discussion.
Yeah, this we'll talk in the next one, whenever you can organize it, Rico.
The question is, can you throw some light on the much talked about connections of Saint Francis Xavier with the Inquisition in Goa? Not today, not today. The short
But
answer is not today. But
we'll go
Alan will
in,
give you a hint
we'll
of
go
it.
into it in detail. But very briefly, I just want to end this with saying that there's hardly any connection.
Hmm. So on that note, we'll
Yeah.
leave you waiting for more.
Yeah.
Alan's book is on its way. It's not one of those books that's going to take months. Hopefully, it's a question of weeks. Weeks means less than a month, and yeah, we should be getting it soon. Looking forward to it, Alan. Thank you so much
Thank
for your
you.
research. Thank you for your time. The monsoons have just started here. You told me it's not yet started in your parts, but thanks so much. A pleasure to have you. We'll carry on with these talks. At least I'm aiming for twice a week if it works for you
Okay.
and for our audience. We'll try to announce it in advance. It would be around this time, maybe 2:30, starting at 2:30, give or take a few minutes here and there. Because by the time we get ready and iron out the glitches, tech glitches, and otherwise. Thank you, Alan, so much once
Thank
again.
you, Rico, for having me,
My pleasure.
and all the people who have taken the trouble to
Yes,
listen.
yes.
Very much appreciated.
Thank you.